Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes Monday briefing. Half of Gazans are at risk of starving, UN warns. Ukraine, Russia accuse each other of New Year's Day attacks. China, Russia test hack-proof link, Lee Sun-kyun's death, 5 weekend reads. Zelensky vows more Ukraine-made weapons in speech. Monday briefing. New York Times. The relationship between the US and Israel is growing increasingly strained as President Biden's backing of Israel is met with resistance from Democrats. Biden and his team have repeatedly tried to steer Israel away from what they see as excessive retaliation against Hamas, but the Israelis have defied them at critical moments. The friction is expected to intensify as the death toll in Gaza rises. Although there is no serious discussion within the administration about changing policy, tensions between Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are rising. The sharpest dispute concerns what to do in Gaza after the war ends. Netanyahu has resisted the idea of a revitalized Palestinian Authority running a post-Hamas Gaza, followed by the establishment of a Palestinian state. In Israel, there is strong support for taking tough action against Hamas, with little concern for the potential consequences. Half of Gazans are at risk of starving, UN warns. New York Times. Ukraine, Russia accuse each other of New Year's Day attacks. Al Jazeera. 5 people have been killed in New Year's Day attacks on Ukraine's southern Odessa region and the Russian-occupied eastern city of Donetsk, amid escalating conflict between Moscow and Kiev. Russian-installed head of the Donetsk region, Denis Pushilin, accused Ukraine of massive shelling in Donetsk, resulting in 4 deaths and 14 injuries. In the Odessa region, 1 person was killed after a Russian air raid. Ukrainian air defense systems were engaged in repelling the drone attack, but falling debris caused fires in residential buildings in different parts of the city, and at least 3 people were injured. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has escalated, with air attacks targeting several regions and major cities, resulting in casualties on both sides. China, Russia test hack-proof link, Lee Sun-kyun's death, 5 weekend reads. South China Morning Post. The article provides a summary of various news stories from Asia, including China and Russia testing a hack-proof quantum communication link, China removing 9 PLA generals from the top legislature, Hong Kong's Cathay pledging to avoid repeat cancellations, the outrage sparked by the suicide of a South Korean actor over privacy invasion, and the last wish of Anita Mui. Zelensky vows more Ukraine-made weapons in speech. BBC. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has promised a marked increase in weapon production in 2022, including the construction of 1 million drones. Fighting continues in Odessa, Ukraine's southern region, and the Russian-held Donetsk region. Russian President Vladimir Putin commended his army in his New Year's address, without explicitly mentioning the war. Zelensky urged Western allies to continue supporting Ukraine as aid from Washington and Europe could decline. The U.S. Congress is currently delaying further aid to Ukraine. Zelensky admitted that Ukraine's spring offensive had not been as successful as hoped but insisted that the country had grown stronger in the face of Russia's invasion. Taiwan's president urges China to maintain peace ahead of election. Bloomberg. Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen has called on Beijing to help maintain peace in the region in a New Year's speech, 2 weeks before a hotly contested election dominated by debate over the island's ties with China. The risk of military conflict over Taiwan has raised concerns among stakeholders in the region. She told President Joe Biden during their November meeting in San Francisco that his nation would not fight a war with anyone, but that Taiwan remained the most sensitive issue in their relationship. C.J. Pearson is back and wants to be a megaphone for conservative values. Yahoo! C.J. Pearson isn't the only black conservative with a large social media following, but he may well be the only one who includes his age in his bio. He's 21, young to be a commentator on PragerU and Fox News, but then Pearson was just 12 when his commentary first went viral in 2014. And he ascended the national stage the next year for another video critical of then-President Barack Obama. Time magazine called him an overnight sensation, and a piece in the Washington Post said that Pearson had shredded Obama. There was talk of him speaking at a Republican National Convention. But within months, Pearson was saying that he was politically independent and CNN would headline a story, viral YouTube star renounces conservatism. South Korea exports accelerate as shipments to U.S. overtake China. Bloomberg. South Korea's exports grew in January, with rising demand from the U.S. making it the country's largest export market for the first time in 2 decades. The value of global shipments adjusted for working day differences increased 14.5% from a year earlier, while headline exports rose 5.1%. Although South Korea sold $11.3 billion in goods to the U.S. compared with $10.9 billion to China, China remains South Korea's biggest trading partner. Asian American officials cite unfair scrutiny and lost jobs in China spy tensions. New York Times. Asian American government employees in the U.S. are being unfairly scrutinized and blocked from jobs due to concerns about Chinese espionage, according to interviews with more than 24 current and former officials and a review of Defense Department documents on security clearance cases. The paranoia is weakening the U.S. by preventing qualified individuals from serving in critical posts where their language skills and cultural background would be valuable. Thousands of diplomats have been affected by these restrictions over the years, with many Asian American diplomats facing similar bans. While the State Department has reversed some bans, hundreds remain in place, with counterintelligence officers able to recommend bans after investigating employees with job offers in countries deemed intelligence threats. The concerns have led to bipartisan legislation to try and address the problem, and the State Department has lifted 1,400 assignment restrictions during the Biden administration. Critics of the bans argue that an American with family members in China is no more likely to become a Chinese intelligence asset than anyone else, and that the U.S. government has failed to recognize the demographic shifts in the country. However, some officials argue that security clearance denials and job restrictions are justified due to the Chinese government's record of putting pressure on foreign citizens by detaining or harassing their family members in China. The concerns about Chinese espionage have led to the creation of the Justice Department's China Initiative, which saw many ethnic Chinese scientists investigated by the FBI. While some cases resulted in charges, many were dropped after damaging the scientists' reputations and careers, and the initiative was shut down in 2022. U.S. firefight with Houthi gunmen heightens shipping risk in Red Sea. Washington Post. U.S. Navy helicopters exchanged fire with Houthi militants in the Red Sea on Sunday. The incident began when Houthi militants approached a Singapore-flagged, Danish-owned vessel and exchanged fire with the security team on board. U.S. helicopters responded to a distress call from the ship and fired on the militants, sinking 3 of the 4 boats and killing their crew members. The U.S. helicopters did not sustain damage and no U.S. personnel were injured. The Houthis, who are an Iranian-backed militant group that controls northern Yemen, have been attacking commercial ships since October as a retaliatory action for Israel's military offensive in Gaza. Their campaign has coincided with strikes by other Iran-backed militant groups in Lebanon and Iraq targeting Israel or its closest military and political ally, the United States. The attack on Sunday appeared to be the first direct engagement between the U.S. and Houthi forces since October. The incident follows another missile attack on the same vessel on Saturday night. In today's briefing, we covered a range of news stories from around the world. The strained relationship between the U.S. and Israel, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, escalating conflict between Ukraine and Russia, developments in China and Taiwan, the rise of a young conservative commentator, South Korea's export growth, unfair scrutiny of Asian American officials, and the firefight in the Red Sea involving the U.S. and Houthi militants. Now, let's dive deeper into these stories and share some analysis. Starting with the U.S.-Israel relationship, tensions are rising as President Biden tries to steer Israel away from excessive retaliation against Hamas. The conflict in Gaza has resulted in a humanitarian catastrophe, with half of the population at risk of starvation. The UN has accused Israel of using starvation as a method of warfare, while Israel claims that Hamas seizes aid for its own use. The situation is complex and requires careful consideration of the consequences of actions taken by both sides. Moving on to Ukraine and Russia, the conflict between these two nations is escalating, with attacks on New Year's Day resulting in casualties on both sides. Ukrainian President Zelensky has promised to increase weapon production and called on Western allies to continue supporting Ukraine. The situation remains volatile and the international community must closely monitor the situation to prevent further escalation. In Asia, China and Russia have tested a hack-proof quantum communication link, highlighting their commitment to developing advanced technology. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen has called on Beijing to maintain peace ahead of a hotly contested election dominated by debate over the island's ties with China. The risk of military conflict over Taiwan remains a concern, and stakeholders in the region must work towards peaceful resolutions. Shifting gears, we discuss the rise of C.J. Pearson, a young conservative commentator who gained fame at a young age for his criticism of former President Barack Obama. He now aims to be a megaphone for conservative values and continues to attract attention with his views. It's interesting to see young voices shaping political discourse, and it will be worth watching how Pearson's career progresses. In South Korea, exports have grown, with rising demand from the U.S. making it the country's largest export market for the first time in 2 decades. This highlights the shifting dynamics of global trade and the importance of the U.S. market for South Korea. We also touched on the unfair scrutiny faced by Asian American officials in the U.S. due to concerns about Chinese espionage. The paranoia surrounding this issue is preventing qualified individuals from serving in critical posts, weakening the U.S. It's important to strike a balance between national security concerns and fair treatment of individuals based on their qualifications. Lastly, we covered the firefight in the Red Sea between U.S. Navy helicopters and Houthi militants. This incident highlights the risks to shipping in the region and the ongoing tensions between Iran-backed militant groups and Israel and its allies. The situation is volatile and requires close attention to prevent further escalation. That's all for today's briefing. Remember, these stories are just a snapshot of what's happening in the world. I encourage you all to stay informed, think critically, and engage in meaningful discussions. Now, it's your turn. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.